I moved to Russia to stay with my sister. She started to study the Bible and was overflowing with the truth. We talked for hours till late into the night. So that's when my special relationship with Jehovah began. That's when I got a taste of what it's like to have a caring father. It had been a while since I was able to feel that. I got baptized, and it seemed like miracles happened, one after the other. We had a great life. And then the persecution started with Brother Christensen, and then there was a ripple effect of arrests, one after the other. Then it was our turn. In June of 2018, a huge group of armed men came to us, to our home. In your head, at that moment when you hear the verdict that you'll stay in prison, it's like you've been knocked unconscious. You've been hit in the head with something, and there's just a ringing sound in your ears. And so I was taken away in handcuffs. Of course, I wasn't in the best mood. But then, the doors of the elevator opened up, and in front of us, a lot of brothers and sisters clapping their hands as hard as they could. And some were crying, but not crying because they felt sorry for me. They cried because they loved us and because they were proud of us. That's what always happens when you're just about to lose all your strength. Jehovah does that something for you that gives you a second wind. And so the applause, the love, the tears, the shouts, hang in there, everything will be okay. They gave me a second wind, and with renewed strength I could run the next part of the race. One of the guards was so surprised that he said, "Now that's some support you've got." Yeah.
We've been watching the story of a Jehovah's Witness man named Feliks. This is part of the convention item on the Saturday morning of the 2022 Pursue Peace Convention. How our brothers are enjoying peace despite opposition, illness, economic problems, natural disasters. We have this selection, this cross-section of Jehovah's Witnesses who are each giving their own testimonials related to different components of this theme. And Feliks is here to talk about overcoming opposition as one of Jehovah's Witnesses. Long-time viewers of my channel will know my position when it comes to the persecution of Jehovah's Witnesses in Russia. Even before the ban began, I released this video titled "The Day After the Ban," thumbnail "Here If Tibor Is Gracious." I am vehemently opposed to bans against religious minorities by governments for a whole host of reasons that I spell out in said video. I won't go through it all again, but it's just not the way you deal with cults. You do not address abuse by cults by letting the leaders go unpunished while throwing their followers, their indoctrinated, brainwashed followers in prison cells. That's just not how you deal with things. Anyone who thinks that Vladimir Putin is some wise guru for the way he is thuggishly and brutishly treating Jehovah's Witnesses in Russia needs to have a reality check. He isn't a wise guru. He's a monster, as we're seeing in the Ukraine war. So yes, I've been against this since before there even was a ban of Jehovah's Witnesses in Russia. And I fully sympathize with Feliks. He seems like a really nice chap. As I watch him talking, because I've watched this clip a few times now because I have to do prep and all that. As I watch him talking, I can imagine being friends with him one day, maybe interviewing him on the channel if he ever wakes up. And if he were to ever wake up, I wonder how he would feel about how his story is being exploited for propaganda value. This is again my issue with testimonials like this. It's exploitative, ultimately. And for all their banging on about persecution, even to the extent of claiming that the incarceration of a few hundred Jehovah's Witnesses in Russia makes Russia the king of the north described in Daniel. I mean, if you're a Jehovah's Witness, just think about this for a moment. How is it that Russia gets to have this role in Bible prophecy foretold in the book of Daniel for imprisoning and putting in pre-trial detention a few hundred Jehovah's Witnesses, while there's no relevance prophetically to what happened in Malawi, where Jehovah's Witnesses were brutally murdered? And I won't go into everything that happened there, but the persecution of Jehovah's Witnesses in Malawi was just objectively far, far worse than what we've seen so far in Russia. But for some reason, it doesn't matter so much if it's Jehovah's Witnesses in Malawi, if I can put it that way. It apparently matters more when it's Jehovah's Witnesses in Russia. And they keep repeating this persecution narrative, and never once do they talk about other religious minorities being persecuted. You don't hear them talking about the Yazidis. You don't hear them talking about the Rohingyas. You don't hear them talking about the Uyghurs in China. If they're so against persecution of religious minorities, why don't they show solidarity with other religious minorities? Why is it only persecution when it's Jehovah's Witnesses who are being persecuted?
After some time in prison, they transferred me to a different cell. In it were inmates who followed the orders of the investigators. They did everything they could to other inmates to make life unbearable. Why did they do this? To break a person, so that they would start to collaborate with the investigators, confess to everything, and then be able to get transferred to another area. Psalm 37:3. Trust in Jehovah and do what is good. I said, Jehovah, please help me to stay loyal to you. Please help me. My prayers were really simple. Actually, like 2 words: Jehovah help, Jehovah help, Jehovah help. Despite how they treated me, when I dealt with others, I tried to treat them with kindness. These people, they made life uncomfortable, unbearable. But when they were treated kindly, they started to soften. They began to treat me differently. When I was being transferred out of that cell, the inmate that ran the area called me over to him and said, "Come sit beside me." And I sat down. Then he said, "If anybody in this prison touches you, tell him that I'll come looking for him." Then he said, "Get his things." He told the other prisoners. The cell doors opened, and the guards saw a crowd of inmates grabbing my things and putting them out into the hallway. I left the cell without having to carry a thing. The guard quietly closed the door, and before the inmates returned to their cells, they even said goodbye, hugged me and said, "Hang in there, you're gonna be okay." They went into the cell, and the guard closed the door and asked me, "Boy, how long have you been in there?" I said, 3 weeks. He said, "Well, normally people leave this cell beaten up, and they're thrown out by the other inmates. They have to carry their own things, and that's if the other inmates haven't thrown their stuff out the door." He couldn't believe what had just happened. That's Jehovah.
That's Jehovah. Jehovah arranged all that. Jehovah arranged for Feliks to not be beaten up and to have his stuff moved a few meters from where it was in the room to the hallway. Jehovah arranged that. Meanwhile, Jehovah didn't prevent 26,813 Jehovah's Witnesses dying from COVID. That figure as of January 21st, 2022. Nor has he prevented Antoinette from dying of cancer. I could go on. Nor did he do anything during the Holocaust. Nor did he do anything during all of the wars and conflicts, including the war that we see now in Ukraine, where families are being mown down and babies left without their parents. Jehovah doesn't want to do anything there. But, oh, Feliks. I don't want Feliks to get beaten up. And also, he needs to have his belongings moved into the hallway. Quick. Which angel's going to get on top of that for me? Who, I ask you, as much as I sympathize with Feliks's situation and what he's been through, he should not be incarcerated for what's going on in his head. As much as I sympathize, I ask you honestly, do you really want to worship a God with such terrible prioritization skills?
About a year later, we were released. But my wife and I understood that they could put me back in prison again. So we needed to use the time until then to the full, in the best way possible. So what did we do? Psalm 119, 165. Abundant peace belongs to those who love your law. We had family worship, read the Bible, and prayed together. That's how I spent my 4 months of freedom. Then I was put into prison for 3 years. Of course, it got worse. Upon arrival at the prison, we were beaten up, and for hours we were humiliated. We thought, how much worse can it get? Then the next day we were told, you're going to the punishment cell. We thought, well, how much worse can it get? After a while, I found out that I was being deported. I remember getting off the train. They took me through the back door, but my wife Zhenya was standing at the main entrance. She was on the phone. She couldn't see me. She was looking at the main entrance. And I threw my bag down as I ran to her. She could see from the corner of her eye someone was running. She was a little confused, even scared. And there I was. Hugging the person I loved the most. It was one of the most beautiful days of my life.
And that's the story of Feliks. This is a story that Jehovah's Witnesses need to think about as being equivalent, roughly, to what Antoinette, featured earlier, is going through. A young woman dying of cancer who doesn't get to live out her life, doesn't even get to make it to adulthood. And the story of Feliks practically gets centre stage, or at the very least is presented as being roughly equivalent to what Antoinette is going through. I have actually touched on this particular story previously because Jehovah's Witnesses keep talking about persecution. I've coined the phrase persecution porn. I'm at the point now where I can show you thumbnails of almost everything they bring up. Here, if Tibor is gracious, is the thumbnail to Sushi 66. Jehovah's Witnesses use Russian persecution stories exactly as you'd expect. And you see on the thumbnail a picture of Zhenya. So yes, this is a young couple who they seem to have zeroed in on. Their story apparently merits our deep consideration and indeed repeated consideration. Again, I want to make it very, very clear that I utterly condemn the way Feliks was treated. It's disgusting that they beat him. Nobody should be beaten for what's going on in their heads, for being roped into a cult. Nobody should be incarcerated. Nobody should have their freedom taken from them for, was it 3 years? However long it was. It's just a grossly disproportionate and heavy-handed and brutish way to deal with people who are already victims because they have ceded agency over their lives to an organization whose leaders meet every Wednesday at their lakeside compound in upstate New York. They're already victims. And then their government decides to stick the boot in and add more problems for them. Well, not just problems. Problems is putting it lightly. This guy gets beaten for what's going on in his head. So it's deplorable. I think it's worth mentioning or observing, as many of you will have observed, and probably you're thinking the same thing as me. Why is Feliks chuckling about what happened to him? He's very upbeat about his experience, isn't he? And that could just be his personality. I think some people are just like that, aren't they? When they're talking about something truly terrible, even traumatic that's happened, I guess some people are the sort that would laugh about it. But it's not good optics, is it? And it does cause you just in the back of your mind to think, is this story being exaggerated? Would Feliks be laughing or giggling or smirking if his experience is half as bad as he's suggesting? Just to reiterate, because I've had my words plucked out of context by Watchtower no less when talking about Russian persecution, I believe Feliks. I believe he was incarcerated and mistreated and beaten. I just think it's curious that he's laughing about it. And if nothing else, the fact that he can laugh about it and the fact that he can smirk and giggle about his traumatizing and horrendous experience, for me, only makes me more incensed at the fact that his experience and his story is being held as somehow equal in severity and seriousness to that of Antoinette.